Great, thanks. So I'm going to just say a few words for about 10 minutes, and then Barry and I are going to chat. And thank you all for having me. Thanks, Barry, for those very kind words, and it's great to talk to such a good crew of people, and many of whom I count as sources as well, so thank you for being here. I'll just start by saying how I got interested in this topic. I came on board at the FT. I had been running economics and business at Time magazine, and then I came on board at the FT about 2 years ago now. And my mandate was to do the biggest global business stories, economic stories in a commentary format. So I do the Monday op-ed column for the FT. And I like to follow the money when I'm trying to kind of narrow down where I should be looking for my stories. So I started trying to figure out where I should focus my energies, and I came across a really interesting McKinsey Global Institute stat that said that 80% of corporate value was now living in 10% of corporations, and these were the usual suspects, many of them the big platform tech companies, but essentially we were talking about the IP and data-rich tech companies. A few finance giants in there, a few biotech, but mostly big Silicon Valley firms. That's where the majority of America's corporate cash is at the moment. So I started looking into that, and around about the same time, two things happened. I came home one day, and I got a credit card bill. And I looked at this bill and I thought, oh my God, I've been hacked, because there were over $900 in charges in $1.99 increments, and I had no idea where they had come from. So I looked and I thought, what's going on here? And then I noticed they were all from the App Store. And then I thought, who else has my password? My 11-year-old son. And so I did put on my journalist hat, did a little interviewing of my son Alex, who's now going to be a star in my book. And it turns out that he had been playing a game called FIFA Mobile. It's a soccer game. And he had, in his own words, sort of fallen into the game. And this usually very well-behaved child, who would certainly not rack up over $100 of charges on mom's credit card, had done just that. And as I interviewed him, I became more and more interested, because I realized that he really wasn't aware of exactly what he was doing, what he was being charged for. It was almost as though he was pulling a slot machine in a casino. He was in a fog. Well, as I began to investigate all this, I realized that's exactly what was happening, because the technologies in this game and any other number of games, apps you can think of, were persuasive technologies that were designed to do just that: keep you online as long as possible, monetize you as much as possible. Now, at the same time, I began hearing just from all kinds of small and mid-sized business owners coming out of the woodwork. Some of them, part of various campaigns, but others just sort of out of the blue coming up to me and talking about how difficult it was for them to run their businesses or even start their businesses in any space that the tech platform firms had anything to do with. And I'll give you one really telling example, which kind of blew me away. I was at a dinner party in New Hampshire, totally off-piste, happened to be sitting next to a guy who was a venture capitalist in Boston, had started and sold 3 businesses. The last one was a data analytics company. And he said, you ought to look into the power of the big tech platform firms and how difficult it is to do patent protection right now, how difficult it is for anyone to get into businesses that are about data that has already been ring-fenced. And I said, well, tell me more. And he said, well, I just tried to sell a business to Facebook, and it was a data analytics company, as I say, and he had put the code in an open source format and allowed the company to look at it for test purposes. They were also looking at another firm, and they had an in-house project going on. And he didn't want to be named because, you won't eat in this town again if you're in the venture capital world and you say anything bad about large tech platform firms. So it'll be very difficult for you to find people that will go on the record about this. But what he told me is that his code had essentially been taken, and that there was really no way. I mean, he couldn't protect his ideas with patents. He couldn't ring fence enough data to be competitive without working with the larger firm. And he confronted, and at the end of the day, Facebook took the project in-house, according to him. I wasn't able to get any comment from them about this. And he confronted his source and said, look, come on, what is this? And the guy gave him a quote, which I just think is a real bell-ringing quote. He said, you have to understand, we're dealing with 6 times as much information per second as the largest banks, but we're making 1/100,000th the amount of profit on it. If we have to pay for anything, we don't have a business model. Now think about that for a minute. I mean, that is, anybody that covers business and economics, that's a pretty profound statement, I think. So I began really throwing a lot of my efforts looking at this area. Obviously the story and all the news of the day has been right there. And I've come to sort of believe in 3 or 4 different points, and this dovetails a little bit with my last book, which Barry mentioned, which was about the financial sector and the effects of the financial sector on American business over the last 40 years. And in that case, I believe that the tail has come to wag the dog and finance is now sort of running Main Street instead of the other way around. And the paradigm is actually quite similar in some ways for platform tech. When you're dealing in a world that's data, not dollars, as Senator Warner was saying earlier, the usual laws of economic gravity stop working. So if you kind of go back to Adam Smith and you think about what did it take to have, in the view of the father of modern capitalism, what did it take to have a competitive market? You needed transparency, you needed shared information, equal access to information, and you needed a shared moral framework. And I would agree that, or I would say that none of those things are in play right now when you think about the typical transaction between the largest tech monopolies and anybody else, be it businesses, consumers. So I think that this is a really important point that we need to consider as journalists, as people that think about the space, work in this space, regulate this space. These are not transparent transactions. This is, I think, not a well-functioning market. And in particular, one of the things that I think is so similar to me as somebody that covered the 2008 financial crisis is the way in which the largest platform firms use complexity to obfuscate. It reminds me very, very much of the way the banks use complexity to obfuscate. And in fact, post-2008, I'm sure all of you saw those crazy flow charts of how CDOs would ricochet from Iceland to Iowa, and nobody could follow it, even the risk managers in these organizations. I think that is a very similar paradigm to what you're dealing with today. And that's why I've been really interested in, sympathetic to some of the arguments that Barry and Open Markets, Lena Khan have made about this being really about power. And it's about economic power, it's about political power. I don't need to go into the details of that, but when you have 80% of corporate wealth, which is most wealth these days, living in 10% of firms, that to me is a real issue. I just want to say one more thing before we start the Q&A portion. Senator Warner spoke a little bit about the way in which economics and security are coming together. And I think that this is a really interesting point for all of us to think deeply about. And I worry a little bit that the security argument may be used as a way to let the big stay big. And I think that this argument that we need Google and Facebook to be as big as they are, or somehow Alibaba is going to take over the world, I simply don't believe it. And I'll tell you why I don't believe it. For starters, if you think about how innovation happens, it tends to happen in a very decentralized way. Yes, the internet was in part based on US government funding, research, but most of the early commercialization of the internet, the real innovations, were done by small firms. In fact, many people would argue, many economists would argue, there's plenty of evidence to show that as firms get bigger, innovation tails off, and particularly as they go public, there's a lot of data to show that innovation tails off, and that's actually something that I explore in my first book. So I think we should be very wary of that argument. I think that even though economics and security may be related in some ways, that we shouldn't let that cloud the debate about antitrust and monopoly, which to me is actually the biggest political risk in this country at the moment. So I'll stop there and we can have Q&A.
Thank you, Rana. That's an excellent beginning to this conversation. And actually, I'm just going to pick up on that very last statement of yours, which is that you see concentration as being fundamentally a political threat.
Yeah.
And could you just sort of unpack that? Because that's actually a pretty important fact.
Yeah, so let me go back historically, because I really do think these parallels between where we are now with big tech, let's say, and where we were around 2008 with the largest financial institutions is really relevant. to my mind, one of the reasons that we're in the political situation that we're in right now is because people fundamentally lost faith in institutions and in the elite. And that was true in the case of the way the post-2008 situation with the bailouts was handled. And I'm very worried that that's what we're at risk of going more deeply into now. You know, when you have a sense that the people that run the largest companies in the world just don't have to show up, you know, that there are empty seats, I think that the majority of Americans, and I grew up in rural Indiana, so I spend a fair bit of time off the coast, which is super healthy. I would encourage everyone to do that, maybe like once a month.
There are no flights anymore to the middle of America.
Right. We need to get Steve Case to fix that. I think people look at that and they just think, you know, if I had any trust to begin with, it's really being eroded. And you can look, I mean, there was some really interesting research done a couple of years ago looking at the rise of usage of social media and fall in trust in liberal democracy, and it is stark. That to me is a hugely worrying thing.
You know, this is I should have held this up before when I was doing the introduction. This is the book that Rana published 2 years ago, Makers and Takers. And, you know, I fell in love immediately with this book because of this frame, because it captures so much of the sort of the tension between, you know, who we are as a nation, who we are as a people, who we are as individuals. Are we makers or takers? And this is a traditional, you know, this is not something you coined. This goes back. And actually, if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, it's a sort of an Ayn Rand coinage, I believe. She was the first one to use it, and of course, it was used in the 2012 election cycle. And at that point, the takers were apparently the 52 or 53% of the population that wasn't paying income tax, I think. And the makers were somehow the financiers that were, I don't know, floating all the debt. And that just seemed really strange to me. And I remember I was trying to think of a title for this book. I was actually in a lake doing the backstroke, and I thought, I want to rebrand this term, you know, because if the last 40 years, which is kind of the time frame I look at in my book, if the last 40 years have shown us anything, it's that, hello, trickle down really isn't working. The things that we thought were going to work in the Chicago School of Economics really haven't. Now, I think one of the reasons that there's still this mythology around that is that these ideas in academia die really hard, you know, and you can still see this thinking all around. In fact, it's funny, I was on a panel at the Council on Foreign Relations yesterday, and I keep getting invited to these places, these very, like, you know, Chicago school places. I guess I'm the, you know, lefty that they think won't scare anybody. So I get invited to these things, and I was just amazed at the fact that people still really, in the C-suite, in the highest levels of Wall Street, don't understand that the rest of the country doesn't think that the makers are the capitalists. You know, they think that the takers are the capitalists, and that's why we have the populism that we do, and that's why we're starting to see an overlap between far right and far left, I think.
Well, you know, so much of this conference today is about, you know, it's you know, the people that say Village Capital, the groups that Village Capital, the young companies and individuals that Village Capital is working to help them stand up and grow their businesses. You know, these are the actual makers. Exactly. And this is also, you know, this is what Kaufman is the right. Kaufman Foundation is seeking to, you know, these are the people who actually make, you know, what it is that we consume, make what it is that we use on a day-to-day basis. And, you know, so we have this sort of fundamental, you know, it really is a conflict here between the avariciousness of Wall Street, which is kind of what we want people to be avaricious up to a point, but maybe the structure now seems to have allowed too much avariciousness into the system.
Right. Okay. So that's a really good point, and I probably shouldn't have been so sweeping as to say capitalist. When I say capitalist, I'm actually using it in the really classical term of talking about financiers and people on the street, rather than the people that are actually starting small businesses, changing things on Main Street. This is, again, a really fundamental change, which I explore in depth in my book, of the way that the entire capitalist system works. So if you go back to, say, the 1970s, you would have found that the majority of all the capital flows in the country's largest banks were actually going into real businesses. They were going to people who were starting things, buying homes, not CDOs, but actually, buying real homes, things on Main Street. So finance was doing what Adam Smith would have said it should do, which is to be a helpmeet to other businesses, the makers. And now, if you look at the minority of capital flows, basically only about 12% or so of capital flows from the biggest institutions go into those real businesses. The rest of it is sort of existing in this closed loop of buying and selling of existing assets, which, I don't want to get too wonky, but does all kinds of things, creates bubbles, creates financial fragility, increases debt in the system. I mean, if you wonder why we are awash in debt, I mean, there is something like, I think it's the latest numbers are 60 trillion more out there in debt than there was before the financial crisis. It's because that is the lifeblood of the financial system. They benefit a lot. The street benefits a lot from debt. Everybody else, it puts them at risk. And there's been a number of wonderful books about this. I would encourage you to look at Sufyan Mian's House of Debt, which is terrific on how debt actually penalizes the little guy more than anybody else. Yeah, I mean, the makers are no longer being served by the financial system. That's a fundamental problem. By the way, the lead of my book, and I'm sorry to go on, but the lead chapter of my book was about Apple. And I was trying to find, I wasn't really focused on tech at the moment that I was doing this, but I was trying to find the most Kafkaesque example that I could find of how badly the financial system was working. And I was looking at, if you remember a few years back when Carl Icahn, the hedge funder, private equity, robber baron, pick your term, owned about 5% of Apple. He was tweeting, every couple of weeks he would tweet that the company should give back more of its cash hoard in the form of buybacks, stock buybacks and dividends. Now, every time he would tweet that, the price of the stock would go up. Tim Cook would announce more and more buybacks and dividend payments. At the end of this process, Apple had promised basically as much as they had sitting in offshore bank accounts, which was about, at that point, 10% of the entire country's corporate liquid wealth. They had promised that same amount of money in share buybacks and dividend payments. So it was like, okay, wait a minute, you've got all this cash sitting over here, wherever it is, in the Netherlands, Ireland, so that you don't have to pay the US corporate tax rate on it, which is higher than the OECD average, but you're going to issue the same amount of debt at cheap rates and you use it to pay back Carl Icahn. Meanwhile, this is a company that hasn't needed any operating capital since the 1990s. And I thought, is that what the markets were set up to do?
After you probably remember this back from early 2009, Jack Welch, who most of you may remember, was the CEO of General Electric for a long time, beginning around 1980. And he came to power at General Electric around the time that we saw the transformation of the political economy in the early 80s with the coming of neoliberalism. And this radical change in how we sort of treat corporations. And Jack Welch was one of the guys who basically said, this corporation, General Electric, exists to serve the shareholder. Mm. And he ran the corporation for many years. And in fact, he kind of turned it into a bank for a long period of time.
Yeah. Well, it was a too big to fail bank at one point.
Yeah. And then he, by 2009, said that was a terrible thing to have done. What that did is that basically what we did as the executives of this corporation is we destroyed all of this value, all of these industrial arts, all of these technologies that are vital to human beings. We destroyed them. We broke them. We took, and that, now he's, since then, that was that moment of remorse in which, this issue of corporate governance, I mean, is this something that we should be talking about? Like, what's the purpose of the large corporation?
Well, yeah, and in fact, I mean, the purpose of the corporation is a topic that academics are thinking a lot about right now. I always look at, I know it sounds wonky, but I always look at where the academics are going, because oftentimes that's kind of where stories, strangely, will tend to bubble up if the researchers are starting to look at these numbers. I think it's a hugely relevant question. I think that there's essentially two problems in the financial system and in the way American capitalism works right now, and one of them is the financial markets and how disconnected they've become from Main Street, which we've just discussed. The other is how financialized corporate America has become. And, we kind of know the reasons for this, right? I mean, once you go public, you have to jack up your share price quarter on quarter, no matter what. That is the sort of end-all and be-all, and the average shelf life of an American CEO is now 2 years. Now, I think that the mistake that we've made and that the C-suite has made is in thinking that by simply doing the kind of financial engineering that Jack Welch did, that doesn't come with any risk, right? There's this idea that if you can't see it on the P&L, that the risk isn't there. But that is just patently untrue. You look at some of the supply chain disasters, which, Barry has written extensively about, and I would encourage everybody to read his Harper's piece from 2002, which is really prescient. There's all kinds of supply chain disasters. People don't even understand where their goods are being made. All kinds of political risk comes with that. I think that is actually a story that's becoming much more front and center now in the U.S. as the U.S.-China trade conflict heats up. And it's fascinating to me. I talk to C-suite folks, on a weekly basis, and there's a real existential crisis going on right now because people know this. It's like the way you know something in a dream and you kind of wake up and you feel bad, and but you don't quite know what to do. It's like that. Every single CEO I know knows that we're not resetting to the 1990s. We are not going back to a totally unfettered, let capital go wherever it wants to go that's the cheapest, because that's led to, I think, a zero-sum game and a real erosion of competitiveness. But people aren't ready to pull the trigger yet, and I actually think it's going to take probably some policy action to make them pull the trigger.
Well, actually, that tees up my next question really well. Because,
we didn't even plan that.
About a month ago, Senator Warren came out with some proposals for some pretty big changes in how we regulate corporations. And just last week, Vice President Pence, sort of looking at the defense industrial base and this incredible erosion of the robustness of the defense industrial base and the offshoring of so much of the capacity that is really vital to our defense. Vice President Pence was sort of attacking the short-termism and saying that the short-termism is part of the problem that is destroying our national security. I mean, do you see perhaps Senator Warner and this administration coming together on a?
Well, it's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, we are in a bizarro world politically right now, right? I mean, it's just incredible. I will give you an example. I'm going to answer that by giving you an example of something interesting that happened to me recently. I was interviewing a person who had worked on Bernie Sanders' campaign, just somebody I like to keep in touch with who's sort of in with that part of the party. And he recommended to me the same book that a high-profile economic and security hawk, who will remain nameless, recommended. Also, a book called Freedom's Forge, which is about the way in which the auto industry was used in the World War II ramp-up industrial surge. And I was like, wow, this is incredible. The reading list is the same between this portion of the right and the left. But what this tells me, to your larger question, to the deeper question, is short-termism the problem? Yeah, I think it is the problem. Now, the solutions differ wildly. The agendas differ wildly. But there was a really fascinating UNCTAD study that came out, UN Development and Trade Agency, that came out with a study recently. And they found that between 2000 and 2014, the data showed that really biggest winners, the most consistent winners from unfettered globalization were big companies and China. And that was really interesting because what it said was kind of what we know about oligopoly, but what it also said was, you know, the Chinese were kind of, you know, maybe playing it smart from their point of view to flout some of the WTO rules. I mean, that was kind of how you were able to keep a leg ahead. And I think that is something that corporate America and certain parts of both parties still really have to come to terms with.
Okay, I want to open it up for a couple questions before we go on to the last panel. But one sort of last question, which is very different than this, what we've been talking about, is you mentioned sort of this connection between morality and market structure. You know, and going back to Adam Smith, I mean, Adam Smith was a theorist of sort of morality before he moved on to market structures. And, you know, my understanding of even like how he understood specialization of labor, you know, he starts off the book with Wealth of Nations with a description of pin making and how the division of labor leads to the production of many, many more pins. And that he saw this as a industry as a way of bringing people together in community. You know, it was the exact opposite vision that he was promoting than what he is remembered for. It was not avariciousness, it was not selfishness. He had a vision of people coming together in community and working together. So this issue of like morality and market structure, I mean, how do you, I mean, is this something that the American people around the world are ready to actually discuss?
I think they are. I mean, I think that all the indicators that we've been talking about today, that many of you that you've just cited, are part of this. I think that they are ready to discuss it. I think millennials. I mean, you look at any number of things about the millennials. They've got a very pick and mix approach to politics. I think they don't feel they have to align themselves with either one or the other kind of old line belief system. They're open to all kinds of new ideas. Economically, socially, politically. I think that that's where we're going. I also think, interestingly, amongst the smartest big business owners, particularly the people who make their money in retail, I would say, you know, like Starbucks, which actually is going to go through its own problems now that Bill Ackman is in there. But you know, somebody like Howard Schultz, I remember him telling me a few years ago, look, you know, we're becoming a nation of latte makers and latte drinkers, and you got to kind of hope you have more drinkers or the math stops working. You know, and it's really kind of that simple. In a 70% consumer economy, if people don't get a wage hike and you can't paper over the problem with debt, and I believe we're coming to the end of the period where we can do that, then the math stops working.
Great. Well, I want to give folks a chance to ask some questions, and Austin Frerick, I think, has or maybe he doesn't, but, oh, there it is in the back. So does anyone have a question for Rana?
You're all stunned by our brilliance.
Hi, my name is Aubrey Ruby. My question, and I'm a longtime advisor to companies investing in African markets. So my question has to do with informality in the gig economy and how these two kind of forces are rising together. And if you look at, for example, most emerging markets, they definitely have oligopolies and they have a vast informal market. So I have argued for some time that if you want to see maybe the future, unfortunately it's not the brightest future for developed economies, it might be going more that way. High Gini coefficients, high concentration, and then tons of gigified workers. So just love your thought on that.
Really interesting point. I mean, so much to parse there. It's reminding me of a trip I took to Nigeria a couple of years ago. Tons of entrepreneurial interest. I mean, like, I think Nigeria could be the new China if they actually had a working infrastructure, you know? The power kept going. I was meeting with these small filmmakers there because Nigeria happens to have the third largest film industry in the world. And just all these incredible makers literally couldn't keep the lights on, you know. Now that's a sort of a government planning issue, maybe, or, you know, you could argue that some of the biggest companies could be doing more on that front as well. They have their own private infrastructures, some of them. but in terms of the fragility of labor in the gig economy, I think it's a real problem, and I think there's a real risk in glamorizing the opportunity that's posed by gig economy work, right? I mean, we've all had the Uber driver, the conversation with the Uber driver. You hear, yes, I like the freedom, but the margins keep getting compressed. You know, you've got just-in-time work at places, you know, big retail chains where you can't plan your schedule. I think that the fragilities and the vulnerabilities, again, favor capital over labor in ways that are they're just not going to help the problem. And in fact, that's something I'm quite worried about, that the shift from tangibles to intangibles, the shift to the digital economy is going to put some of the problems of neoliberalism on steroids because it's just going to add speed to all the problems that we already have.
Thank you, Rana. I'm Alex Lasky. Question for you you talked about neoliberalism problems on steroids. You mentioned it yesterday at the Council on Foreign Relations, and people think of you as sort of a weirdo lefty, perhaps. But
not weird. I write for the FT still.
In this room, you're in a lot of company. What's your sense? You mentioned Howard Schultz, but there are other people, presumably in the C-suite, who agree with us. Who are those people? I mean, we hear about Howard Schultz, but who are the others who believe that the trickle-down doesn't work and that workers need to be paid more?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So, I mean, my experience, I could kind of name names. You probably know some of the names that get bandied up. I mean, you know, Mark Bertolini at Aetna, I think, is somebody that's interesting. There's a bunch of people that have started a group at Harvard to sort of look at these issues. There's a number of other business groups that kind of meet informally, people that care about these issues. You know, I think that there are any number of financiers. I think Larry Fink and Jamie Dimon probably do care a lot about these issues. Now, I think that people would come to very different policy conclusions. And I think that my sense is that two things: the business leaders and the C-suite folks that I see that really pay attention to this tend to be those that they've touched it somehow in their own customer base or within their operating models. I mean, Bertolini got interested because Aetna was having quality problems. They had the stock was down, revenue was down because they had just terrible customer service. And when he started digging into why, which BTW, there was a metric on everything except for who the frontline service workers were. Didn't know who they were. He told me it took him a year to find out that 70% of them were people that were either vulnerable in some way, single moms, no benefits, taking public assistance. I mean, these are the people that you have on the front line answering customer problems. Well, no wonder they're pissed. They're working for a healthcare company and they don't have health insurance, you know? So, oh, that's a business problem. And then you solve it, and then you start to touch these issues. I also will say, the personal really, the more I report, I've been reporting for 30 years now, the personal really is a big deal. It's interesting to me that the economists, the few economists who have ever gotten this are ones that grew up in the Rust Belt. Joe Stiglitz, you know, people, I mean, it's just interesting. And I think that there is still this sort of siloing where sadly people mostly in positions of power on the coasts are just still kind of slowly coming to this topic. Yeah.
Hi, Rana. Andy Green from Center for American Progress. And I kind of want to follow up on your last point. I mean, one of the challenges, I think, in advancing this debate, and I think we've seen tremendous advancement, is making this tangible for ordinary people, for politicians that want to talk about it. I think we saw several examples today that really can be tangible. From the black funeral operator to the worker with a non-compete clause to the family farmer that can't bring something to market. Wonder if you can share a little bit more about your thoughts as how this is developed, and you know, do we have to wait for a financial crisis like we had in 2008 for the challenges of Wall Street to be really tangible and in folks' face?
So that's a great question. I mean, in terms of the latter, so I actually think that we're kind of in the middle of the next crisis in a funny way. You can't quite, you don't feel it in the same. We're not talking about a Lehman Brothers moment, because if you think about where debt, I watch debt because debt is always the run-up in debt is always the biggest predictor of crisis. And I know I'm going macro, but I'm going to go micro and answer your question. Debt has moved from the largest banks into the largest corporations. The corporate sector has more debt than ever before. Now, the macroeconomic environment is changing big time right now. We are in a real crunch. You can already see it. I mean, I don't know what the market's down today, but obviously the volatility the last few days it's that dream state. It's the market being anxious, knowing there's some things not right, and what's not right is that we haven't had any real Main Street growth for real people since, depending on who you're counting, either the early 90s or 1970. So that's what's happening at a high level. So drill down, how does that affect things at a smaller level? Well, I think that there's a lot of really interesting experiments that are taking place at a city level. So I missed Victor, I missed your talk, but I'm sure you may have mentioned some of that. Victor at Kaufman has got tons of great stories about local communities that are trying out all of these different experiments in policy stuff, in compensation, in, hey, maybe when we do economic development, we should fund entrepreneurs and not just look at the sheer highest number of jobs, because that's going to bring Amazon to your city, and then the rents are going to go up so high that nobody that's not rich is going to be able to afford to live there, et cetera, et cetera. So I think those conversations are happening. I'm sort of still mulling over the lessons that can then be taken and applied at a national level. And I'm not going to lie and say that I have some like magic 3-point playbook on that, but I think that events like this, where we talk about them and trade ideas, are a great start.
Actually, so I think it's time for us to end, but I just want to, just a real quick question so that we, I think, end on the right note. What makes you, I mean, you travel a lot. In fact, you have a crazy travel schedule. I mean, because we've had the sort of honor of being able to work with Rana on a few events, and when just trying to get Rana into Washington it's a really
Logistical.
it's a
Thank you, by the way, for the open
challenge. I
market
mean, it makes
logistics staff.
most supply chain systems look quite simple, but just in all of these travels and all these people that you're talking to, what is making you hopeful right now?
That's a great question. I think there really is opportunity in crisis, and the crisis, I mean, to go back to Andy's point, the crisis is not so much a Lehman Brothers style crisis, it's a crisis of trust, and we're in it. We can see it here, you can see it in Brussels, you can see it in Beijing. And I think that penny has dropped, as they say in Britain. I think that people get that now, and they get it in a way that they didn't get it in 2008. I remember one of the reasons I did my book is that I didn't hear anybody give a really coherent 360-degree view of, like, how did we get here? How did this just happen? And I think that there is a coherent view now. Main Street and Wall Street are disconnected. Corporations literally, economically, politically have too much power. I mean, just look, anybody, that followed the Jackson Hole, the Kansas City Fed meeting in Jackson Hole, just go on their website, look at the reams of research showing you that too much concentration of economic power is bad in almost every possible way. The central bankers are paying attention, and I think the fact that you got, 3 senators here and a commissioner, politicians are paying attention now too, so that's hopeful.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking Rana. Thanks.